Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kalman Weiser. I'm the Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies at York University and Acting Director of the university's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to the center's annual Wolinsky Lectures in Jewish Life and Education. This endowed lecture series exists thanks to the generosity of the Leonard Wolinsky Foundation and has allowed us to hear from experts on diverse topics in Jewish studies of broad interest for more than 40 years. In fact, the speaker in the series' inaugural year, which was back in 1979, was none other than Israeli statesman and scholar Abba Eban. Originally from Winnipeg, Leonard Wolinsky was a businessman, investor, and Jewish communal leader who came to live in Toronto. We honor his memory and contributions today with talks meant to bring together the university and the larger communities. We would also like to express our thanks to his daughter, Mira Adler, and her son, Dan, who is a professor in the Department of Visual Arts and Art History at York University, for their support in the lectures throughout the years. This year's theme, Sweet Jews, is the brainchild of our colleague, Professor Carl Ehrlich, who is now on sabbatical pursuing archaeological work in Israel. The pandemic prevents us from realizing his original vision of combining engaging talks about Jews and the historical relationship to sweets with a sampling of these items. But we hope to welcome you to our physical campus for future events in the fall of 2022 and to make good on the promise of delicious desserts. Before commencing today's event, it is important that we recognize that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Catherine Power.
Thanks, Kalman. First off, just to echo again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm just so pleased to welcome and introduce Rabbi Deborah R. Printz to the Koshitsky Center and this Wolinsky Lecture on Jewish Life and Education. Rabbi Printz has held a number of leadership positions in the national and regional reform movement, having served the Central Conference of American Rabbis as Director of Program and Member Services and the Director of the Joint Commission on Rabbinic Mentoring, the Rabbi Emerita of Temple Adat Shalom, San Diego County, California. She was its senior rabbi for almost 20 years. Rabbi Printz is the author of too numerous articles and pieces to name all of them, but of course, including On the Chocolate Trail, a delicious adventure connecting Jews, religions, history, travel, rituals, and recipes to the magic of cacao, as well as the forthcoming books, The Boston Chocolate Party and On the Trail of Jewish Celebratory Breads. She was awarded a Starkov Fellowship and a Director's Fellowship from the American Jewish Archives, as well as a Gilder Lerman Fellowship from the Rockefeller Library to pursue the research for On the Chocolate Trail, incorporating knowledge gained from travels in Belgium, Canada, England, France, Israel, Italy, Mexico, Spain, Switzerland, and throughout the United States. On the Chocolate Trail explores how faith traditions share consumption, ritual, and business interests in chocolate. It also became the basis for a traveling museum exhibition and is linked with her online project on thechocolaterail.org, a wonderful site to get lost in with recipes, blog posts, and articles. My 6-year-old and I have a semi-regular Sunday baking tradition since he was about 3 years old. So Sunday strikes me as just the perfect day for all things to do with baking and that special joy of sharing and learning about and forging culinary traditions in the home. So despite my own pretty staunch loyalties to Team Poppy Seed when it comes to all things baked treats. I could not be more excited to learn from Rabbi Deborah Printz today when it comes to all things cacao. So take it away, Rabbi.
I'm unmuting and I'm going to share my screen. So thank you so much for that introduction, Catherine. And we could debate poppy seed chocolate issue if you wanted to, but I think we'll just move on to chocolate. It's great to be with everybody today. Thank you so much for the invitation. It would have been lovely to be in person and to taste whatever chocolate you were able to rustle up for an event, but I'm glad to be with you virtually nonetheless, to talk about how Jews have found resilience through chocolate since the early European contact with chocolate, which might have been Sephardi Jews, and we can talk about that. So I'm going to share some stories that I learned while I was researching on the chocolate trail, and acknowledge, as in a similar vein to the introduction shared a few minutes ago, that chocolate is a colonial extract product. It is a luxury product that a lot of people don't have an opportunity to share. I do speak about what is the best chocolate from a Jewish values perspective. I'm not going to do that today, but there are certainly a number of our Jewish values that we can bring to bear on our chocolate eating and our chocolate choices. Today, I'm going to talk about chocolate as an immigrant food, a migrant food. It itself as a product is resilient. It goes through a lot. I'll talk about that in a minute. Chocolate is also l'dor vador, from generation to generation, beloved by Jews. It migrates to Europe and from North America initially via Sephardi Jews and others, not exclusively Sephardim, but certainly Sephardim had a great part in that story. And then Ashkenazim become part of the story a few hundred years later. So the chocolate trade, including production and consumption, parallels the migrations of Jewish refugees of the last 5 centuries. These are stories of opportunity and sustenance and resilience. So I'm going to divide the talk into 3 parts, talk a little bit about early chocolate making so you understand how chocolate is indeed resilient as a product, talk about some of the Sephardi stories I learned, just a few, and some headlines of the Ashkenazi stories. I'm wondering how many of you might have stocked up on chocolate when the pandemic first started. And if you'd like to indicate that with the hands signal, you could do that. Perhaps some of you have also been turning to chocolate regularly for comfort and support during the pandemic. This is just a shot, I hope you can see it, of chocolate making in Oaxaca, Mexico. This is a more contemporary electric machine for making chocolate. I'm not going to play the video that accompanies it because it's very loud, but it is a less sophisticated form of chocolate making, but it does show you that there is a grinding process. The beans are put in at the top of the machine. The ground chocolate comes out at the bottom and sugar is added. And that's just a start of how chocolate is processed, like our spiritual souls. So here's a picture, screenshot really, of an Israeli chocolate company. Some of you may have tasted this product called Holy Cacao. Notice the beautiful Torah stam letters, the special decorations on the Torah letters that you see in the brand, the logo of this chocolate company. This particular page from their earlier website gives the bracha, the blessing for the chocolate, and also alludes to a passage from the Shulchan Aruch that talks about crushing food products, and that is similar to how we need to process our souls to grow spiritually. And chocolate is also crushed and processed to become the delicious sweet that we enjoy. You may know that chocolate actually grows on a tree. I'm not going to advocate to you that this makes it healthy. We can talk about that later if you'd like to, but it grows in these pods, 20 degrees north of the equator, 20 degrees south of the equator on these cocoa trees. They're about the size of a small football. They come in these various colors, as you can see. So these colors, when you slash the pod open, what you would find is white pulp and purplish seeds. Those purplish seeds don't become chocolatey flavored or chocolatey smelling until they're fermented and roasted. The roasting process, here is an example of it from the reconstruction of chocolate making at Colonial Williamsburg. This is over an open fire in a pan. There are different ways of roasting the chocolate, but this is one example of roasting the chocolate. Then it has to be shelled. There is a close-up of the shells and the beans after they're roasted, and then they have to be processed. Like you saw the Oaxacan version of processing. This is an earlier and probably still available process for grinding cocoa beans in Central and South America, and probably some other parts of the world as well, using a stone, a piedra, a metate, a pierre, chocolate stone. And this gentleman is grinding by hand, very laborious, very labor intensive. You might be able to see under the stone that there is a warming pan that enables the process to go a little bit more quickly, but it's still, I've tried it, it's extremely difficult. Once the chocolate is formed into a paste, then the paste is collected into a ball or a tablet. It might be mixed with sugar and spices at that point. It might not be, and those tablets or those balls are set aside for later until chocolate is ready for drinking. And keep in mind that chocolate initially in the first European contact and the oldest usages of chocolate preceding European contact in Central and South America was only as a beverage. The chocolate balls or tablets might have been stored in this jade pot that you see on the left-hand side if you had that kind of means and wealth to access that kind of beautiful pot. In the colonial period in North America, chocolate would have been stored in used rags, old newspapers. When you're ready for your beverage, for your hot chocolate, you would grate those balls into a chocolate pot that you see here on the right-hand side of the slide. Water would be mixed in. This would be placed over heat. And the molino, the chocolate wooden stirrer, would be used to mix the water with the chocolate, and it would be warmed, and you would be able to consume it, as I said, as a drink. Here's another shot of a chocolate pot. If you were fortunate, again, to have access to a Delft chocolate cup, well, this is what it might have looked like. But a lot of people, of course, were drinking out of very simple cups in the earliest days of chocolate drinking. Or gourds in Central and South America. Here's my friend Luis making chocolate in Oaxaca, having bought the chocolate from that merchant that you saw earlier on with the modified electrical equipment. He's stirring the chocolate, has been grated into this standard soup pot. He's using milk, and he's stirring with a molino, that wooden stirrer, and you see a pile of them over here on the right, again, from a Oaxacan marketplace. So let's go on from chocolate as a resilient product and a migrant product to learn more about the Jewish stories, starting with those Sephardi stories. I first learned about the connection between Jews and chocolate, having been to Sunday school and confirmation and Jewish studies classes in college, and 5 years of rabbinic school. I only learned about the connections between Jews and chocolate when I was traveling in France on a sabbatical trip afforded by my congregation in San Diego. And my husband, Mark, and I, who were traveling, we were stopping into some chocolate shops. We happened to go into a chocolate shop named L'Atelier de Chocolat de Bayonne, the studio for the making of chocolate from Bayonne, France. I have to be very clear on the East Coast, especially, that this is not Bayonne, New Jersey, but this is Bayonne, France. I happened to have my Choco-Dar, my radar for chocolate experiences, kick in this chocolate shop. I happened to pick up their company literature. I happened to read in my high school French what is written here, that Jews exiled from Spain brought chocolate making to France through Bayonne and the suburb of Saint-Esprit. I reread it because it was after all my high school French. I reread it and thought about this and realized, oh, that could make sense. Oh, I was very surprised. I really did have to think about it for a while. And then I thought about the expulsion of Jews from Spain. I thought about the lines of dispersion or the paths of dispersion of Jews from Spain, the dispersion starting earlier on before 1492 and then after 1492. And of course, Jews migrated to the east from Spain, but also to the west. And here you see these green lines, and they coincide in some cases with chocolate centers where Jews and others were making chocolate, and Jews became known in some of these places as chocolate specialists. So there is this intersection between chocolate making and Jews and the dispersion from Spain. Mark and I, my husband Mark and I, Mark's also a rabbi, were able to visit Bayonne, France, and you can see where it's located, very close to Spain. So Jews who wanted to be freer from the Inquisition, there was still an Inquisition in France, but they wanted to have a little bit more breathing room and escape from Spain and or Portugal, could relatively easily access Bayonne. It was a port city. It was on a trade route up to Amsterdam, and it's also accessible via the Alps if one chose to do that. To show you that Jews were living in France and Bayonne in 1695, here's a ketubah, and everywhere we went in Bayonne, France, they kind of told this same story about Jews bringing chocolate making to France. It's pretty intriguing. It was on the postcards, it was on the city website, it was in local chocolate museums. It was pretty much a repeated story everywhere we went. Jews brought chocolate making, Jews exiled from Spain brought chocolate making to France. And nevertheless, when I researched more deeply into the story of Jews in Bayonne and their chocolate making, I learned that they suffered a number of disabilities. They suffered disabilities in Bayonne, France, that were similar to other places in Europe that we would associate with Jews in some European repressed cities and settings. So this is a contemporary building on a site where a Sephardi individual named Andrade was said to have tried to retail his chocolate despite the local prohibitions that required Jews not to retail in Bayonne proper. Jews could not live in Bayonne proper. They had to live in the suburb of Saint-Esprit. They could not stay in Bayonne making their chocolate after sunset. They could not be making chocolate on Sundays or Christian feast days. And so they were schlepping that chocolate stone. This is how they were making their chocolate then. They were schlepping the chocolate stone from the suburbs of Saint-Esprit into Bayonne. So while they were telling this story about chocolate being brought to France through Bayonne, Jews nevertheless were suffering from some of the disabilities that were familiar to Jewish communities elsewhere. Now here is a plate of stamps issued by the French Postal Service in 2009. It's beautiful. I love to think about chocolate stamps. I think the Swiss and Belgians also have chocolate stamps. Some of them have chocolate aromas. The glue tastes like chocolate. They're great. And this tells a lot of the history, this plate of stamps tells a lot of the history of chocolate in general and also in France. And I'm not going to go through all of the stamps, but you see in the top middle, a conquistador, an explorer, perhaps Columbus. On the far left, you see the chocolate pod that I showed you earlier on. Below the chocolate pod, you see perhaps Marie Antoinette or some royal who was enjoying chocolate. You see a bit of industrialized chocolate to the right of that royal woman, a chocolate bar, and to the right of the chocolate bar in the bottom, chocolate pot and a chocolate cup and a child eating chocolate on the far right. And then above that, the Postal Service in France privileges Bayonne and its chocolate history. And in Bayonne, they privilege the story of Jews bringing chocolate to France. We may never really know who brought the first cocoa bean, the first chocolate stone, the first recipe for making chocolate to Bayonne or to France for sure, but they do certainly like to tell that story, and that's the story that they're sticking with, at least in Bayonne. So we're going to move from France to Oxford, England, to the High Street in Oxford, England, where there's a cafe called the Grand Cafe, where this marker exists, the first, and identifies the first coffee house in England. Coffee house culture became very significant in England. And the records from this coffee house from the 17th century indicate that not only was coffee sold here, but chocolate was also sold. And it was created by a Jew named Jacob the Jew, before people had last names, before Jews, or this particular Jew had a last name. He was named Jacob the Jew, brought chocolate and coffee to Oxford, England, the first coffee house in England that also sold chocolate. So I'm going to not show you every single chocolate that I tasted as I traveled on the chocolate trail, but there is a glimpse of what the High Street looks like and the Grand Cafe. We're going to move on now to chocolate making in New Spain, where Jews were also involved, very involved actually, in the chocolate culture of New Spain, which is Mexico. And they went to New Spain relatively early on to escape the Inquisition, though there was also an Inquisition in New Spain. And these Jews, this is a contemporary Spanish chocolate pot, but I love it, so I'm showing it to you in connection with those stories. These Jews practiced or used chocolate in their rituals. So Jews in New Spain were using chocolate in their Kiddush for Friday night. They were drinking chocolate before the fast of Yom Kippur. They were ending the fast of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, by drinking chocolate. It was a chocolate drinking culture. They were also drinking chocolate for breakfast and for supper and for break time. And they were sometimes outed to the Inquisition because of their chocolate consumption. They were merchants as well. They were retailing chocolate as well. But there's at least one story of a couple who were so afraid that their chocolate abstaining from chocolate drinking on Yom Kippur would out them to their Inquisition, because their non-Jewish servants would see them not drinking chocolate on Yom Kippur, as would have been customary in their home. They staged a fight and retreated to their private rooms and their private spaces to save themselves from the Inquisition. So Jews in New Spain in Mexico were very immersed in the chocolate culture of their day, and they were also using it in their ritual practices. Here is an 18th century Inquisition record that shows that this woman, Violante Montañez, was selling chocolate, and she was accused of the crime of practicing Judaism. So Jews were still under suspicion in the 18th century, and she was still in the chocolate business. Here's another Sephardi story. This one takes us back to Europe, to the continent, basically. The story is having to do with Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, known as the Hida. And as far as I know, the first written record of a rabbi or rabbis and chocolate. He was a Sephardi individual born in the Holy Land, was sent as a shaliach to Europe, traveled throughout Europe, and kept a diary. He was also a halakhic scholar, a Jewish legal scholar. He kept this diary of his travels, and at least 10 times in his diary, he records that he had some sort of experience with chocolate. Either he was gifted chocolate, or he drank chocolate with the leaders of the community, or he was at a bris where chocolate was part of the celebration at the end of the circumcision of a newborn child. And at one point, he became so hungry as he was traveling over the Alps that he reports in his diary that he ate raw chocolate, which I'm sure is not what we mean when we talk about raw chocolate today, that you get maybe in a health food store, he was probably eating from that chocolate tablet or that chocolate ball before it was made into a chocolate drink. And here, that was a shot of his travels, and this is a page from his diary where the Ma'agal Tov, where I've underlined the Hebrew word in Rashi script, in the special script associated with the biblical commentator Rashi. And this is how the Hida has recorded in this printed version of his journal, chocolate. In Hebrew, modern Hebrew, we would say chocolate or chocolata. And he has sort of given it kind of an Italian twist, and that would be something to look into further at some point. So we're going to leave Europe and we're going to come to North America and to the colonies, and we're going to consider some of the stories of Sephardim, still for the most part in the British colonies, who were in the chocolate business, retailing, merchants, trading, and in the personal consumption. They were also personally consuming chocolate. Then I show you the baker's chocolate. I'm not sure that you have this in Canada. I just don't know. You'll tell me. And this is packaged in the States, at least, often as America's oldest chocolate company, and since 1780. And indeed, it may be the oldest continuous chocolate. It may be the oldest branded chocolate, but Jews certainly surely were making chocolate and in the chocolate business before bakers started and after bakers started. So here is just some examples of colonial chocolate pots. I unfortunately was not able to find an example of a chocolate pot made by the famous silversmith Myers or anybody else, for sure, any other Jews who definitely used them, but they are quite beautiful. I did find, however, Nathan Simpson, who was a Sephardi individual, who was a significant trader, traded a lot between New York and London. And this is the printed form that he used, just one example of many, to ship cacao. If you notice the red box on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see cacao, and he has, or his agent has used a Star of David to indicate who he is, and he's shipping in 1719, way before bakers. And if we look at these Jewish estate inventories, we see that a number of Sephardim, Bueno, Pinero, Lucena, Lusado, Gomez, and Lopez were trading and in the chocolate business, and had access to cocoa beans and chocolate pots and chocolate cups way before 1708, 1709, 1725, 1750, before bakers. So let's focus on one of those stories, the stories of the Gomez family in New York City. This particular family was quite prominent, founders of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. 5 individuals in 2 generations of the Gomez family were in the chocolate business, in some aspect of the chocolate business, trading, retailing, consuming. And one of them was a woman, Rebecca Gomez, who is one of just a handful of women in the colonial period who was associated at all with chocolate. And she is the only Jewish woman that I am aware of who is in the chocolate business. But she's part of this great Gomez family, and she's advertised a number of times, a few times, maybe 10 times in local New York papers. This is one example of one of her advertisements from 1779. And she's calling her place of business the Chocolate Manufactory. It's at the corner of Ann and Nassau Street, which is a corner that still exists. It's a dry goods shop. But you can see from the lower right-hand part of the slide that she's also advertising her own manufactured chocolate, warranted free from any sediments, and pure, great allowance made to those who buy to sell again. So she's, I can't say for sure that she's herself on that chocolate stone, but she's supervising at least the manufacture of that chocolate. She's warrantying it as, pure, and she's retailing and wholesaling that chocolate. Another example of a later advertisement, 1782. And so that gives you a glimpse into the Gomez family's chocolate businesses and enterprises. There's a lot more in the book on the chocolate trail about the Gomez's, as there is about Aaron Lopez, who was in Newport, Rhode Island, a cousin to the Gomez family, has his own significant story of support for the Jewish community and the Touro synagogue, and was in the chocolate business, retail, manufacture, and trade. And you see from his account books that he hired individuals to grind chocolate for him. And if you are able to read, perhaps you can see that this individual is described as a chocolate grinder. There is a kind of profession associated with people who were grinding chocolate, the way you saw that individual grinding before. Because it was so labor intensive, it was often done by slaves or servants. And that is a story that we can come back to if you'd like to. Aaron Lopez was born in Portugal and came to Newport in order to practice his Judaism freely. So maybe it's not a surprise that he was also involved in the synagogue. And here, the red arrow highlights that he was distributing chocolate, among other foodstuffs, to poor Jews on behalf of the synagogue. At the top of the page, just under the underline, you may be able to read that it says tzedakah. He was distributing foodstuffs as a means of tzedakah to indigent Jews. And again, the arrow shows us on this page from April 14th, 1772, that here Joseph Pinto is grinding, a Sephardi compatriot of Lopez's, is grinding chocolate for Lopez for Pesach, specifically for Passover. And I don't know of any other reference to chocolate and Pesach before this. And I don't know for sure how the Lopez family might have been using this chocolate for Pesach, except maybe to imagine that Lopez was dipping his matzah into his chocolate drink. Speaking of drink. Now, here we come to the unfortunate reality that Lopez died a premature accidental death in 1783. And this is his estate inventory, which again shows us a number of chocolate items that you saw summarized in the earlier slide. So those are just some highlights of the Sephardi stories, and we're going to turn now to some of the Ashkenazi stories. This one has to do with Israeli chocolate. And let me go back, I'm sorry, that was a little too fast. This chocolate company named Lema was located and still is actually in Riga, Latvia. It was owned by Jewish families. One of those co-owners decided to make Aliyah to Israel. He anticipated what was going to happen with the Soviet takeover. And in fact, this company was taken over, confiscated, nationalized by the Soviets. But Mr. Fromenchenko had already left for Israel, where he started the Elite Chocolate Company. Very familiar chocolate para, that, as some Israelis call it, and some of this wrapping may be familiar to you as well, on the right-hand side. But its logo initially was what you see on the left of the slide, and it was quite popular to emphasize agricultural accomplishments in Palestine and the early days of the state. And so having fresh milk in your chocolate, and for the pioneers to be involved in farming and milking cows, was just really a great value. And so milk chocolate became the preferred version of chocolate. So thus we see that chocolate para, the logo. Max Brenner was bought. Some of you may know of Max Brenner, a very creative version of a chocolate company, was bought by Elite, and then Elite was bought by Strauss. And so it's a multinational conglomerate at this point, but very popular. And we can talk a lot more about Israeli chocolate if you would like to. Certainly, Israelis love their chocolate. And another Ashkenazi story that we'll come to now is the story of the Barton's company, Barton's Bonbonniere. which started in the States in New York, but was founded by Stephen Klein, who had lived in Vienna, was in the industrial chocolate business in Vienna, was an Orthodox Jew. When his business was confiscated by a Nazi after the Anschluss in 1939, he decided the next day to leave Vienna. He escaped. He left his family behind, but eventually was able to bring them over to America. He started out in New York by peddling chocolate, and then eventually created an extremely successful chocolate business. He, as an immigrant, brought over that migrant food. And some of you may be familiar with these products. They're very popular in the States, even though the company is no longer family owned. At one point, they decided to produce a Haggadah, and if you'd like to speculate as to why a company making chocolate would produce a Haggadah, we can talk about that. If you're familiar with Maxwell House and why the coffee company produced a Haggadah, we can also talk about that. Barton's at one point, I think, had something like 50 to 60 stores across the country and had these wonderful mid-century stores. And Stephen Klein, Orthodox practicing individual, closed for the holidays. He was very adamant about educating Jews and non-Jews about chocolate. The products were kosher, and he brought over other refugees. It wasn't enough that he brought over his family, he brought over other members of his extended family and others to work in the business. And here's another Ashkenazi story having to do with Albert Einstein. This was Albert Einstein's childhood chocolate cup given to him by his parents. His sister Maya had a similar cup, and the two cups were in the exhibit Semite Suite, which is now available to travel to venues not needing security, not needing humidity control, just the facsimiles and the photos and the labels travel at this point. And one can speculate when looking at this image of Albert Einstein on his chocolate cup about the connection between genius and chocolate, and maybe we should all be eating more. And also, his mom must have had something to do with combing his hair in those days. It's great that the Leo Baeck Institute in New York City has the two chocolate cups in its collection. Now, I didn't want to skip over Canadian chocolate, and I want to share very briefly a story that is in greater detail told at my website on the Chocolate Trail. It is the story of the Ukrainian-born Louis Wolinsky, who brought candy making and chocolate making to Montreal. When he was born, as I said, in Ukraine, and started his company, I believe, in 1939. Whoops, sorry, a little too fast on that button. And he was on the left-hand side is this invention he created for chocolate pops, which were quite a sensation, apparently. At one point, his production line, kosher for Passover line, was stickered. The products were stickered by the rabbi, the mashgiach, while the Easter candies apparently were on another production line. In any case, it's quite a story, and it's a Canadian story, and it's a Ukrainian story in origin, and it does allow us to at least acknowledge what is going on in Ukraine, the fight for democracy, the hope for freedom that we all share. And this is, of course, the Wolinsky story is, of course, also an immigrant story. That's what the second edition of the book looks like, and I'm so excited that it is in a second edition, and I believe that the link was posted for you. Here's what a little glimpse of what the exhibit looked like and the branding that we are able to share with those other hosts. I think that you already heard about the Boston Chocolate Party and the forthcoming On the Trail of Jewish Celebratory Breads, and I'm going to skip over these very beautiful, delicious looking chocolates to share with you what the recipe, what the bracha would be for chocolate. Should you be so tempted to eat some right now, which I don't blame you, of course, if you are eating chocolate right now, I would love to join you. And I want to wish you all a lot of blessing on the chocolate trail, and hope that you stay healthy and that you also find resilience in lots and lots of places, and that perhaps, like our ancestors before us, Sephardim and Ashkenazi, we all continue to find our own resilience and our community's resilience through our connections and enjoyment of chocolate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Printz. You can hear a resounding electronic clapping that our 111 plus guests will be making through their absent Zoom faces there. They won't be cheering because their mouths are full of chocolate.
There you go. I'm going to mute and be on hold for questions, right?
Great. So Rabbi Printz is going to stick around, of course, for our second lecture. As we do with these Wolinsky lectures, we have a pair of lectures. For those of you who have questions for Rabbi Printz or develop questions come to mind during the next lecture that Susan Banjamin gives, please jot them down in the Q&A, and we will get to them after the lecture. My name is David Kaufman. I'm the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry, an Associate Professor in the Department of History, and the Associate Director of the Israel and Golda Kashitsky Center for Jewish Studies here at York. And it's now my great pleasure to welcome Susan Banjamin, a history of culture and communications researcher, a journalist, college professor, a communications strategist and entrepreneur, and the author of 10 books, the latest of which is titled Sweet as Sin, The Unwrapped Story of How Candy Became America's Favorite Pleasure, which you'll see soon enough in a link you'll see a link for soon enough in the chat, if you'd like to click on it and order yourself a copy at some point. Ms. Banjamin belongs to the Culinary Historians of Washington, D.C. and the National Press Club, and she's the founder of True Treats Historic Candy, perhaps the only research-based candy company on the continent. The title of her talk this afternoon is The Jewish Sugar Trail, From Ancient Israel to Penny Candy Stores. I look forward to facilitating a Q&A after Susan's lecture with both of our lecturers today. So as I say, feel free to pose questions directly into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen or save them up for the end of the talk in about 45 minutes from now. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you very much. And I am happy to be here. And hopefully, can you guys all see me? Can everybody see me okay?
Yep, you're good. I can see you very well.
All righty, and here I am. And good. So what I am going to talk about today is, of course, the Jewish sugar trail from ancient Israel to penny candy stores. And what I want to talk about first, however, is myself. And the reason why I want to talk about myself is not because I'm totally narcissistic, but because it really explains a lot about what candy is, and in terms of me being Jewish and in my life growing up. So I am originally from Massachusetts, and I grew up in the suburbs, but my family, my extended family, were in Boston, Mass, and more specifically, Brookline, which is a little Jewish community. It's really wonderful. And to me, that was the universe. And the biggest slice of that universe was Irving's penny candy store, which I used to go to with my very sophisticated cousin. And she would take me, and in my eyes, sophisticated, she would take me and I'd get one of those little baskets and put the candy in it. It was so very exciting and wonderful. And the woman who owned it, whose name was Ethel, had this store for how long, I don't know. But suffice to say that she moved there when she was probably in her 20s. And she stayed in that candy store till she was, I think it was 101. And she never missed a beat. I mean, other than being sick, she was in that seat in that candy store. Little did I know, as I went and just, bought these exquisite little candies that I put in my basket, that in fact, what she was doing was what Jews had done for a long time: bring things from different cultures, different places, different flavors together, and also to teach. So she told me later, when I was a journalist, I interviewed her, and she said that her job was to teach kids how to use money, how to figure out how much to spend and not to spend, how to value what they got. So it was an amazing place and kind of the end story of what we have. And now I want to start at the beginning of that. And the first thing that I think we should do here is to break some myths. So when you hear about sugar, you probably think, oh no, it's so bad for me. Oh my gosh, why are we talking about sugar? But on the one hand, and on the other hand, you might be thinking, oh yeah, I love sugary drinks or whatever. So when you go to have sugar, just know this. Sugar is really important to humanity, because if we don't have sugar, we cannot survive. Our bodies need it. The first taste babies have in their mouths is sugar from mother's milk. As you get really, really old and you start to lose your all your various tastes, which happens, you still have the taste of sugar. And it is, in the end, really important that we have. The problem is that marketers figured that out and wound up putting sugar in everything. And so now we just have way too much sugar, but we need sugar. It's not our enemy, it's our friend if we do it right. The second thing is candy. So candy is a mixture of sugar and then usually a spice or a fruit, which would become the flavoring. That's really important too, because candy has often been seen as a terrible, oh my gosh, candy, really? When I tell people I'm a candy historian, they always smile. They go, really? Are you? Like, who could research candy? What is there to research candy? And it's funny because I was recently on a NPR affiliate, National Public Radio affiliate, and they didn't want to call me a candy historian. They wanted to call me a food historian. So I said, yeah, fine, food historian works. It's still food. But we don't take it seriously. But we need to, because the origin of candy goes so far back, and it started as the medicines, and the sugars were the medicines, and evolved into the candy that we know today. So that's what we're going to talk about. And the role of Jews in the spice trade and in the makings of sugar all the way through the present time. And of course, it's a story that's amazing because it really is about being pushed out of so many places and trying to find a space somewhere. And all the while, as they did that, planting these literal seeds, but really planting the cultures from all of these places that they went to as they traded the goods and so forth. So we're going to start, though, here as looking at what the universe of Judaism, say, and people as Jews brought to the universe of sugars, sweets, candies. All right. So there's something to remember here, and it's so important. I think we all forget it. I don't know about you. Many people forget it. Is the role of symbol. We don't live life on the surface. We live it underneath, and we live it subconsciously, pre-consciously. So much that we do is based on that. And these symbols are created through many things, but there's no question that one of those things is, in fact, the Hebrew Bible and the writings, the various parts of who we have and what we have as how we live. And so there are some symbols that just kind of bubble up that I really want to share with you. And it's so significant that you will see the link between the ancient lives that we had as Jews and then what we do today. So one of those is, one of those symbols is the almond. Now, as most people know, the almonds are Middle East and Mediterranean and really important to that. But behind the story of the almond is the fact that the almond is the first tree to flower in the spring. And so it has these beautiful, beautiful flowers. It came to represent, as being such, it came to represent good beginnings. So who knew? So now we have people throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean celebrating the almonds. But the first real view of the almonds, the first celebration of it, came back to Song of Songs, for example, and to Exodus in various parts of Jewish writing. So we find the almond today in such things as Jordan almonds. So if you go to a wedding or if you go to a banquet or anything quite like that, you'll find any place with good beginnings, you find the Jordan almonds, also called the dragees, right? And that's why they're there. They're there to celebrate good beginnings, as is marzipan, which is largely made up of almonds. And then, of course, we have iterations of the sugar-coated almonds, which go way back, right, as I mentioned, and the cinnamon sugar almonds, and so on and so forth. So that's one example I'm going to give you, is the honey. So honey, it's kind of a strange thing in a way. And I'll tell you why. Because honey is of great value to those of us in North America. We love it, right? But it isn't like sugar. It's honey. And it's risen up in our estimation. So if you really want a good cup of tea, you really want to have it with honey, right? Because it's so important. So the honey that we read about in the biblical honey is actually, maybe it's the honeybee, maybe it isn't. From what I could find, the honeybee was there, but it wasn't there a lot. And that's fascinating because we still perceive it as having been the milk and honey, the honey of milk and honey. But in fact, very well may have been davish, right? It may have been the fig honey. It may have been honey from the dates and from various things. So the question is, or the irony is, as we love honey, and it goes back to that, I'm sure, why don't we love figs? And you might be thinking, well, we don't love figs because we don't have a lot of them around. But well, here in the States, I know that we had the figs since the 1700s. I lived in Massachusetts, and now I live further south, not too far, in West Virginia. And I have fig trees, and I did in Massachusetts, and they can go pretty much all over the place. For some reason, figs didn't make it. Then why did the honeybee? Another question. And the answer to that, I'm sure, has to do with migration and identification and so forth. But the reality of the honeybee isn't native to North America either. It came here, variously. You hear that either the late 1500s or into the 1600s with the Europeans, probably the British. They brought the hives over. They set the bees free, what was left of them anyway. And it kind of worked. And the bees wound up taking off and heading out all around the hospitable parts of North America. So you have these native people who are seeing them, the indigenous people, and they're saying, what are those? This is really strange. They didn't have a name for them. So some of them, at least, and I believe this is fairly widespread, call them the white man's fly. So you can imagine these big swarms of bees spreading out, and the people who would just look at them, oh my gosh, what could it be? And they did know by the way that the white man would follow. But the honey from these bees has been, of course, of great significance. There is one point, though, that we don't want to lose with this. The oldest candy, or one of the oldest candies in history, excuse me, is in fact the honey with nuts. So in this case, the honey with nuts is the sesame seed, as you could see. It could have been many other nuts of the Middle East, but they make it, mix it together, and then lay it out. And basically, it was a brittle. So if you want to make this at home, I can only tell you do it in the winter. We do sell that at my shop. I have a retail store in addition to all the rest that I do. And I'm telling you, the first time the sun is out and the heat warms up a little bit, it's really kind of slushy. But there are companies who make it, and it's pretty amazing. And I don't know, I really like it, but it's really ancient, it's really important, and it goes back to a venerable place. Now we have the sweet cane. So the sweet cane was it biblical? Wasn't it biblical? We don't know. But many people do believe that the sugar cane was the cane that you would find in Isaiah, for example. And what's important here is that eventually the Jews of the spice trade in other places, leaving for other reasons, would come across the sugarcane and actually be one of the forces that made it what we know today. So the sugarcane is, it's an interesting cane, or it's an interesting food because it was considered a spice. It was from Southeast Asia, right? But it wound up in India. And that's where the majority of sugar cane for a long time came from. And it does today, other places as well. But the sugar cane there was available, obviously, to Jewish people who were living there as well. So you find the sugar cane having kind of multiple lives here and multiple influences that would affect the Jews during this time period. So the next aspect of all of this is Jews in the spice trade. And personally, I find this so amazing. I touched on this earlier, that you have these Jews who are bringing food or spices, herbs, whatever you want to call them, from one part of the world all the way to another. Now, I know, we all know that you don't have these Jewish people who are really like hiking from China over to Portugal or to England or wherever. We know this. There were all sorts of connections with other Jews, Sephardic or Ashkenazi, and it does, that just kept this thing moving. But the reality is that a large part of it was the Jews. So why spices? Why Jews? Why spices? So spices, because you couldn't transport them, and they were really important for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was that the salt was the preservative. I'm getting old, I forget words, sorry. The salt was the preservative of the time. And stuff was really, really salty. If you love salt, you know what I mean, right? I mean, I can eat a salted pretzel, but oh my gosh, a salted bagel on both sides, can't get near it. So you can OD on salt, and people, it just didn't taste good. Besides that, now you're getting into the Middle Ages and so forth. You've got meat that's rotting and so forth. And you have spices both to cover up the taste of the salt, right? So that it isn't as bad, but also to cover up the taste of the rotting meat. There are other reasons for spices also, which I want to get to in one second. But the question is, why Jews? So at certain times, there was a great deal of tension between Christian and Muslim, and it was the Jews who could go and do some of the buying for Muslims primarily, and also make it work because they were multilingual. So there were a lot of issues there that worked in the favor of those Jewish traders and merchants and so forth. So what else about spices? Well, let's take a look at some of the spices that were common and that we know that became candy today. One of them is cinnamon. So cinnamon, you've heard it, and it's in Song of Solomon and so forth, but it was also one of the important spices of the
Excuse me, Susan.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We aren't seeing your slides on this side.
At all?
At all, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
Oh, my word. Okay, tell me what to do. My beautiful slides.
Just down at the bottom, there's the share screen button.
Whoops. Oh, I can't believe it. I'm so sorry.
Your talk up to this point was so engaging that I wasn't sure if you had decided to use your slides.
Oh, no, I want my slides. Oh, my word. What do I do? I'm not trying to get them back up there, though. Oh, my. I may not be able to use them if I don't know how to do it. Can one of your producers help me here?
Certainly, yeah. So are you seeing the green share screen button down at the bottom?
No, I am not.
No? Okay. Let's see here. At the top, you might be able to find a share screen button. Anything there?
No. Oh, this is so sad. I guess I might as well just go on and talk about it, you think?
Sure, you can certainly
Yeah,
do
I think
that.
that's fine. It's been really
Okay.
engaging. And
It has been.
yeah.
All right,
And I'll
well,
remind everyone before you restart up that everyone's free to use the Q&A to type in some questions or comments for one or both of our speakers today, and we'll look forward to getting to them in the Q&A.
Okay, and may I add to everybody there that I was so thrilled to send you my PowerPoint, because the pictures are really old and they're really amazing. And I'm so sorry you don't have them. So please email me and you'll have my email address and I will send those to you. Is that good?
That's great. Would you like me to share your email address with the participants?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, I'll do that and you keep going on with your talk.
All right. So yeah, so stay in touch and you'll have that. So anyways, so we have the cinnamon. So I mentioned the cinnamon, which is from the cassia. It could be either cassia or it could be Ceylon. So the cassia is actually from Southeast Asia, and it is the cinnamon that we know of most commonly. Ceylon came from Sri Lanka, probably around the 1500s, but they're both really important to our health. So the cinnamon is medicinal. So I mentioned that candy came out of the medicines. And in fact, it did. And one of the medicines was, of course, the cinnamon, which was used for stomach and was used for problems with throat and so forth. And then again, it did become a candy. So what's important here, again, I want to go back to cane sugar for a minute, if that's okay. So the cane sugar was used as a medicine into the age of candy as we know it. And what they would do is boil the cane. It was called boiled sugar. Haha, no surprise, right? And then they would add the cinnamon to it or whatever the spice was. And that would become the medicine. They added other things as well, but that would become the medicine. And then from there, and historically, then it became what's known as stained glass. It's this flat kind of glassy looking sugar treat. And then that became the drop. So when you get a candy drop, it originated as the cinnamon of the spice trade mixed with the cane. And there you have it. So that was one. Another one is the ginger. So ginger is also, you know what it's like. It's important for your health if you're nauseous or whatever. Ginger is very interesting because ginger came over with the British, and they were the British sailors who got to North America, and they were so seasick on the way. It was just horrible. And so what did they do? They had the ginger. Pirates had ginger. Everybody had ginger as a cure for seasickness. Now, it's important to remember, at least with the sailors, they didn't sign up to be sailors. They got forced into being sailors. They may have been these kind of kids without much money or any money who got taken off the street, put on the ship, boom, there you go. You're a sailor. And so there's sort of a poetic justice in there. I'm not really sure what to call it, that in fact, in the spice trade, that is one of the things that the Jews had carried with them and used, and it could have been by sea, it could have been by land, depending where they were in the transport, but that is ginger. Also, just a little nut here to connect it, the ginger also is growing in India, and again, that's where you do have a community of Jews and where it is of importance. The last one is nutmeg. So please get my PowerPoint because you'll see these pictures. the nutmeg is just amazing. So that was on the spice route. We don't use much nutmeg today in North America. Other places they have candy made from nutmeg, but not really. We do use nutmeg though in comfort foods. The story of the nutmeg itself, of course, is really, it's just a really harsh story, and not something that we need to go into now, but it was part of the spice trade, and you have the nutmeg. So this is how the nutmeg looks. The nutmeg is a round ball, and on top of it is this red kind of filmy color cover. And it kind of looks like plastic is just over the nutmeg. And the nutmeg is the inner part. It's the brown part, and the covering, the red covering, is actually mace. And mace is what mace, right? It's the spice mace. It's what goes in your eyes. Oh no, it's mace. That's the mace. Underneath it, then, as I said, is the nutmeg, and we use it in cakes. We use it on holidays when we're cold. And then, of course, nutmeg was an important part, or a part of the chocolate drinks of North America. They had nutmeg. They had cinnamon, of course, lots of sugar, chili peppers, and whatever added to the chocolate drink. So that's important. I did leave one part of this story because I think it's a really funny and really amazing part of this story. So what our Jewish ancestors were carrying had all of this medicinal value, but many of them, the three I just mentioned, plus cardamom, and maybe verdicts out about sugar, cane sugar, but what they were carrying were aphrodisiacs. All of these have aphrodisiac qualities. So if you're in trouble that way, just go eat some ginger, who knows, or nutmeg. But the story of nutmeg is particularly remarkable, I must say. Nutmeg was it was used in various ways. So one is as a flavoring, as we talked about, with some medicinal value. So people ate the nutmeg, and it made, they enjoyed it. But if you eat enough of the nutmeg, then it becomes an aphrodisiac. And I sourced this to several places, including UCLA Medical Library, because nobody's going to believe me that grandma's nutmeg is actually an aphrodisiac, but it is. And then if you keep eating it, it becomes a hallucinogen. And that's why the nutmeg was called the mystic spice, because it created hallucinations and visions that mattered to them. Now, in telling you this, I do want to add that I don't know of any connection to Jews at all with that aspect of nutmeg. But certainly it was prevalent, and in the 60s in the States where I was, a Jew named Abby Hoffman, who was a yippie, they called him, he advocated that everybody try the nutmeg, but not for the right reasons. So there's that. So now we're going to kind of walk across a bridge, and we're going to look at Jews in the spice trade. So we're talking about the spice trade, which is pretty amazing because it started around the 10th century BCE, think, King David, and it went all the way through the 1800s. And the spice trade in this case, and this, by the way, I know I talked about it, I should add, is the spice trade number 2, right? So and it's one spice trade, but this one is focusing on sugar production. Sorry, I wish that you could see my slide because it's all laid out right there. So the sugar production it has so much to do with Jewish history in so many ways. So what I do want to let you know, first of all, is that history, if you know a lot about it, which most people do, history is not neat. It's not clean. It's all over the place. And it's messy, and you don't know where things started and you don't know where things end. So you do your best to try to figure it out. You get together all the pieces and so forth. Now, the cane sugar, as we mentioned, in this case, started in India, right? And the cane sugar there, of course, was available to the Jewish population. Then enter or not even entered, it had been going, but then let's look at the Inquisition. So now we have the Inquisition, and Jews are leaving Spain and they're going to Portugal, and things are so much better in Portugal. Whoops, nope, no, they're not. And they head to other places, which include the Netherlands. And while in the Netherlands, they had relative kind of, they were okay. Were they really free to practice whatever they wanted? We don't really know. Some say yes, some say no, but it was a haven there at the very least. And this we know, and we also know that in the Netherlands, there were windmills, and there were a lot of windmills. And the Jews had familiarity with windmills there. Okay. So one of the places we're talking about is the Netherlands. And then we're looking at Brazil. All right, so Brazil. How did the Jews wind up in Brazil? So we don't really know. It's another question mark, other than maybe they were in Brazil because the Dutch were there. And they stayed there until the Portuguese came back and were ready to go with the Inquisition. And some of them left, and they may have gone to the Caribbean. We don't really know, though, because now let's talk about the Caribbean. Okay, let's talk about Jamaica, which is wonderful place. If you go there, it's just great. And many people thought that, and one of the ones who did think that was Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus, as pretty much everybody knows, was kind of an interesting guy. The prevailing question is, was Christopher Columbus a converso? So we don't know that, but what we do know is that, and now we get murky again, Christopher Columbus went to Jamaica. What wasn't Jamaica yet, but went to Jamaica. And while he was in Jamaica, he sectioned off the southern part of Jamaica to be a place where Jews could go and practice Judaism and could live freely. Is that true? Well, it's mostly true, except that there's some people say, yeah, Christopher Columbus. Some say his son, Diego. No, not his son. It was more in the 1500s, and it was his grandson. But somehow there's this connection to Christopher Columbus and Jews in the Inquisition, and it's important to what we're talking about because, again, it is about sugar. So I don't know the answer to Christopher Columbus, but it's pretty interesting to think about, and especially because near Jamaica, then we have Barbados, okay? And now we have sugarcane in a whole new venue. Sugarcane grew really, really well there, and the Jews who went there, for reasons which are unknown. So it could be that the British wanted them to go in the early 1600s when the British were in Barbados. The Spanish and Portuguese had been there earlier. Or it could have been that the Jews chose to go there from places like Brazil, where they left, or because they were in the Inquisition and they wound up going over to Barbados as one of the options that they chose. There isn't really a clear answer to that. So you have to say, how did Jews get there? Why did they go there? And ask all your questions, and which is right? And the answer is simply yes, right? History is murky. The answer is yes. So they went to Barbados, and there they had the sugar cane, and they brought with them knowledge of how to process sugar and the ability, technical ability to do so. So they went, and there was no question, and I want to talk about enslavement for a minute. There was no question that enslaved labor was used in sugar production. Absolutely none. We know this. It's true. It's true in the States. It was true anywhere you had sugar. And it was true pretty much at one point, at least in Europe, anywhere you had anything. That slave labor was just a tragic event in the lives of people. and in production. So in Barbados, bizarrely enough, this is so bizarre, the British did not want the Jews to have ownership of sugar production because it was too profitable and it was too good. But they didn't want the Jews to leave, that was for sure, because the Jews had the technology, they had the ability, they, you know, and again, in a technical sensibility, that kind of ability, and they were able to do that. So what happens? They tell the Jews that they can only have the right to 2 enslaved workers, and that was it. So they kept the Jews from actually controlling the sugar industry by depriving them of a workforce. So it's a kind of strange twist there. And what we can make of it is that when the Jews finally were able to have their own sugar production, then in 1706, I would imagine that the sugar production end of it was already taken by the British and they could join in, but couldn't to a really large extent. Having said that, the lives of these enslaved people, and I'm kind of laughing at just like the absurdity of it, the lives of these enslaved people were ludicrously bad. And the production also entailed the boiling of sugar. So now what you have is sugar. It is a process called the Jamaican train. And you have sugar, big sugar cauldrons, I guess you could. On the cauldron, you have sugar that would be boiled, and this boiled sugar would go from cauldron to cauldron by enslaved laborers who would take these scoops and move them from one cauldron to the next. Highly dangerous, very difficult work, but they did it. Now it's interesting, when I was researching, I was in Barbados, and they were still using the Jamaican train, train called train, because it went from one to the next. They were still using it, and I said to the guy there, why are you still using, I just couldn't believe it. Why are you still using this? And he said, so that we could have employment. We could give people employment here. I'm not sure what it was, but that may have been true. They weren't processing that much sugar. I'm not really sure. But in any event, that is what I saw there. And the Jews really were involved in it. Barbados today has more windmills working or defunct than any place in the world, barring the Netherlands. So it's pretty amazing. And that did start the world that we know today of candy. That was the value of sugar. So why cane sugar? Just let me address that then, because now we're getting into the modern universe of candy, and one of them actually is the Tootsie Roll. The difference between cane sugar and other sugars is that it could crystallize so well. And you could take the cane sugar and you could use it to make all sorts of things, where honey, for example, didn't work. Sorghum, which is native or became native to North America, came over with enslaved people. Sorghum, now, you can use it as a sugar, but you can't really cook with it. So cane sugar went out and brought us a number of candies, and many with Jews at the helm. So one I want to talk about is the Tootsie Roll. And we all know the Tootsie Roll, and the story is pretty dynamic and amazing. I'll just let you know that as part of another thing that I was doing for an NPR affiliate, I did get to go to the Tootsie Roll Industries headquarters. Lucky me, it was wonderful. And see how they were making the Tootsie Roll. So the Tootsie Roll was made originally in 1896 by Leo Hirschfeld. Okay, he was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and the vice president of a confectionery company called Stern and Stahlberg. And what he did was he invented the Tootsie Roll and he invented a wrapping machine. And this is important because you're looking at a time when people, and they would pour it into bags, and they take the bags and they would wrap them up and hand it to the customer. And it was a difficult process. Once you get the wrapper on it, as we know today, you can put it anywhere. So there was quite a big, influence there. And the Tootsie Roll it just spread all over. Now, in 1917, the employer of Leo Hirschfeld, who was, as I mentioned, Stern and Stahlberg, closed, or they didn't close, they sold out to the Sweets Company of America. So that was in 1917, right? By 1920, Leo Hirschfeld, unfortunately, got fired. Who knows why? He tried starting his own companies, nothing worked. So in 1922, this is not a story I tell any of the kids who I might meet, but he did kill himself. And it isn't even clear why, what happened, we don't know, but he did. And unfortunate. It was a bad ending to that part of the story, but a good ending for what follows. So the Sweets Company of America did pretty well, but then around 1935, we don't know why, maybe the Depression isn't clear, they started to do really, they just were going under, not a good situation at all. So a guy named Joseph Reuben and Sons bought the company. Now, Reuben, Jewish guy, was making paper boxes for the company. And he didn't want to lose his best customer. So what did he do? He bought the company, and it worked. He bought the company, he owned it until he died, and then his, I believe his son took it. And then what happened is his son-in-law became the head of the board of Tootsie Roll Industries. And he and his wife, Ellen Gordon, pretty much, turned it into this, well, it was already a success, but maintained the success of the company. When he died, Ellen Gordon became the chairman and CEO of the company, and she remains so today. And she is the one who I interviewed. I should say, I met her. I didn't meet her there in Chicago. I met her in Cambridge, Mass, where they have a wonderful company there. And she is just such a delightful person. I did ask her why she loved owning Tootsie Roll, and her response was because it makes people smile. And I thought that was kind of funny because on the one hand, she must have said that about 200,000 times to any reporter who asks her that. But on the other hand, and here's what's so true, it's true though. I mean, people love candy. It makes them smile. And it's not even a footnote. It's really like the story about candy. People like it. It's a marker in their lives, and it makes them happy. Today, the company makes, are you ready for this? 64 million Tootsie Rolls a day. The factories operate 24/7. During World War II, they were a code word for bullets or missiles, depending who you ask. So that's Tootsie Roll. But what's really important is that Ellen Gordon is doing what those people in the spice trade, Ellen Gordon is doing what they did. And what they did was spread things around. So what she has done with Tootsie Roll is to spread things around by buying out companies who sold other candies. And in doing so, really important, candies, small candy companies, various candy companies, they're all going out of business. You may know that. When you walk in to buy candy, they're all the same candies. There just aren't many left. So here she is, no question, it's a business decision. But what she's doing is she's spreading the candy around, making sure it's there. What do they make? They make Junior Mints, they make the Wax Lips and Nickel Nips, and they make those out of Concord Industries, which are where? Which are in Canada. They make Double Bubble and Charms, and the list goes on and on. So she's kind of perpetuating the story here of spreading and making things available to ever more people. Another example is the Jelly Belly. So the Jelly Belly started as, and again, I don't know if the old ancient Jews were involved in this or not, but it started somewhere around the year 900 in the Persian Empire and the Arabic apothecaries. And it was used as a medicine, and it was called lokum, lakumi, you know, depending on what it was, right? Medicine, and that became a candy. Why it is called the Turkish delight, though, is another issue. It wasn't really Turkish. It was all throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East and into the Ottoman Empire. It became really, really well known because of the Sultan who liked it so much. And the British then called it Turkish delight instead of lakumi or lokum or, you know, whatever the iteration was, because the people of England, they didn't want to buy something they didn't know the name, right? It wasn't quite right. So they got the they got the Turkish delight kind of on the roadmap of candy. It wound up in my hometown of Boston, and there in Boston, somebody put a sugar shell on it, sent it to the Union soldiers. That became known as the jelly bean. And later, it was the basis, and in some form, with the Germans in around 1921 for gummy candy. But when did the jelly bean become the jelly belly, you may ask? And if you don't, I'm going to ask it for you because it's another really great metaphor. That happened in the 1970s with a guy whose name is David Klein. And David Klein was in Hollywood. He was in California. He learned about candy from his aunt who sold candy to liquor stores. And he knew all about candy, and he had been doing sales and some kinds of candy work with a company called the Herman Golitz Company. So that company was the one he went to with this great idea he had. Don't have jelly beans with the candy on the shell, have jelly beans with the flavoring, on the shell, have the flavoring in the jelly bean. And it would be so good. And so he told them about it, but you know, they didn't have a name. He was watching the show called Sanford and Son when the musician Leadbelly, the blues musician, came on, and he thought the name was Leadbelly. He thought it was Jelly Belly, and he came up with the name Jelly Belly. And the candy took off. The sad part is he got booted out of this company that he had been so involved in. And after a 5-year lawsuit and after a movie that came out about it with Amazon, he got a settlement, but it never was even close to what it could have been. And that's the sad story. The happy story is that Jelly Belly is everywhere. And again, telling the story of spreading the tastes and the flavors all around the world. And can you imagine how many of those flavors that the Jewish ancestry of the Jewish company of Jelly Belly and David Klein, even originally? Can you imagine how many flavors are there in their racks? They may not even know it, but it's true. They are carrying that tradition. I'm almost out of time, but I'm not totally out of time. So even though you can't see me in my wonderful slides, which please ask me for them, I'd be happy to get them. I do want to tell you one last story, which is a story of hilarity and irony, and it's really wonderful. It's from the Just Born Candy Company. All right, so hear this. It's Just Born from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Jewish? Would you imagine Jewish? Yes, Jewish. So Sam Bourne was a Russian immigrant who came over in 1910 from Brooklyn. And in his time, originally, he made such things as chocolate sprinkles, which I had in Massachusetts. I don't know if you Canadians have it. They were called, but these sprinkles were a little different. They're called jimmies. And they were bigger and longer than the teeny little sprinkles. So he invented the jimmies, which is a version of the sprinkles, which I loved when I was a kid. He made the hard chocolate coating used for Eskimo pies. Did you ever think anybody even invented that? And he made a machine that mechanically inserted sticks into lollipops. Big deal, right? Make me easy to make. And so on and so forth. He was quite a guy. Anyway, he wound up in Brooklyn. He wound up going to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where a lot of candy makers went. Part of it was proximity to dairy farms. Part of it was that it was inexpensive. And it was a good place to go if you're a candy maker. So to make a long story short, they wound up making their own version of jelly beans, and they had chocolates. And they bought a company that was in Lancaster. It was called Rhoda Candy Company, nearby Lancaster. And he went in and he bought them because they made, these little jelly beans, and he wanted them. And what did he see there in the company? He saw a bunch of women sitting there making this marshmallow candy. And they looked like chicks, like little chicks, like, get it? Little peeps, right? And so he loved that idea. He bought into it right away. And they started to make these little marshmallow peeps. But it was really hard to do. It took forever. So around 1953 or so, the son, Bob, who was an engineer, figured out a way to make a machine to make these little chicks, these little peeps. And he ran the little chickens through the machine. But oh my gosh, guess what happened? The wings fell off. They kept getting stuck in the machine. And so, being smart and Jewish, of course, what did he do? He found a solution. How do you get these little peeps through the machine? Oh, I know, cut off the wings, no more wings. And that's why the most iconic candy of the modern age and Easter time is made by a Jewish guy who cut the wings off of a marshmallow peep. And there you have it. So I just think it's a wonderful story. It's a very broad story, and it connects in so many different levels to who we are as Jews and what it all means. So thank you so much for being here with me and for having me. It's just such a delight to tell this story, and I appreciate your listening.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Deborah, as well. These are two really fascinating, interesting, wide-ranging talks that went really in all kinds of interesting directions. So we have some time for a Q&A. Deborah, if you want to turn your camera on, then our audience members can see you too. And I'm going to just curate the ones that are in the Q&A, and for all of our participants who are with us, feel free to type ones in the Q&A, and we should be able, hopefully we'll get to most of you. Okay, first question, which I think is probably for Rabbi Printz, because came in a little early. One of our guests wants to know if you're aware of the very long history of the Havilio family in Jerusalem, which apparently dates back to the 15th century after their expulsion from Spain. A family who in more recent times were manufacturers of hard candies and other sweets in Jerusalem under the business name Havilo Sweets.
I'm afraid that I don't know that company, but I believe that there is a Reform cantor at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion with that name. She may be from the family, but I do not know. I know a little bit about chocolate in Israel. I don't know so much about candy, although I've eaten plenty of it in Israel myself.
Let's go.
Maybe Susan does. Maybe Susan knows them.
I don't know them.
Okay.
Sorry.
Question for Susan. Are you familiar with the history of the Cracker Barrel chain candy stores across the states? And do you know if they have Jewish connections?
I don't know about Cracker Barrel other than that they came from the South, and that people keep telling us, oh, I know historic candy. I find it at Cracker Barrel. And we say, no, that's retro. It's different. But that's about it. And I don't know. I don't know much about them. I wish I did, though. They're marketing geniuses.
Back to Rabbi Printz. One of our guests wants to know when and in what country, when and where did people start drinking cacao with milk?
Probably relatively late. Don't know for sure when drinking chocolate with milk happened. The fat in the chocolate and the fat in the milk don't necessarily combine well, at least in a hard chocolate product. So it's not until the 19th century that we have chocolate milk bars, let's say, or eating chocolate. I showed you the image of my friend mixing milk into his hot chocolate, but he's an American born, 21st century guy. So it probably was a question of how much dairy there was available and whether it made sense to actually mix it with chocolate. Chocolate, was one of the 3 stimulant drinks to come to Europe from elsewhere: tea, coffee, chocolate. Chocolate was the first to come to Europe. My guess is it sort of faded with time in terms of popularity and access, because it's as we saw, very complicated to make, probably more expensive in the end. And those products, however, did have milk added. So I don't really know the answer to the question.
Can I help out with that one?
Yeah, please.
Do you mind? Yeah. So the chocolate was made with milk when milk was around, and the chocolate parts that you showed were where they would mix it all together. So you see in the 1800s and even in parts of the 1700s, they would have the chocolate and they would have the stirrer in that little hole there. And it took forever, to your point. It was really hard to make, but they would really have to stir it for a tremendous amount of time, mix in the various spices, mix in the sugars, mix in the milk and so forth. And it would become extremely frothy. And that's when they would drink it. So chocolate's never been an easy food, and it certainly wasn't then. And the milk chocolate, to your point, came much later in the late 1800s, partially from Nestle, Henri Nestle, and work done in Switzerland. And
I think that goes to the point about milk being accessible at Switzerland. There's lots of dairy products and cheese products, and there was but the initial combination, if I'm not mistaken, was using a milk powder, because the milk powder, once milk powder was developed, it was easier to mix with a chocolate, and then you had a chocolate eating product. Anyway, maybe there's other questions.
There are lots of great questions. I'm going to combine 2 of them.
Sure.
One of our guests wants to know if there are candies that have religious meaning or are used in religious ceremonies. And another guest asks a kind of related question about any interesting history of the chocolate gelt story. So I've combined them because chocolate gelt on Hanukkah is, maybe not formal religion, but it's clearly part of our religious ceremonial, ritual practices, at least among North American Jews. So I'm going to combine those, like candy or chocolate that have religious meaning, or specifically the gelt thing.
So I'll let Susan answer the candy thing, and I'll answer the gelt thing. But you want to go first, Susan?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, chocolate. So I'll speak to the chocolate gelt question. So there is a chapter in my book about chocolate gelt and how it came to be. Of course, gelt is a long time association with Hanukkah, because for lots of reasons. Initially, perhaps the Maccabees had loot left, and it came to be there's an association with wealth and Hanukkah. Later on, perhaps teachers in Eastern Europe, maybe Central Europe as well, Jewish teachers were not paid for teaching Torah. There's a mitzvah of not accepting payment for teaching Torah, and they were maybe given gifts, perhaps of money, one time a year in December. So there are a number of associations of gelt with Hanukkah. The question is, when did gelt come to be associated with chocolate, right? And when did chocolate come to be associated with Hanukkah? Mark and I were traveling in Belgium at one point, and we were there at the beginning of December, and we were approached by these young people wearing these white coats with writing all over these coats, and they were holding beer mugs and jingling coins. We didn't understand what they were asking for, but there were a lot of them, and it was a big festival time, and we saw lots of chocolate Santas, but not really Santa, St. Nicholas's, right? It's tall, thin, chocolate molds and chocolate shaped St. Nicholas's. I think to myself, okay, what is going on here? We checked and we found out that it was the festival of St. Nick's. And one of the aspects of the celebration of St. Nick's has to do with those coins. They were collecting coins, but coins are related to the miracle of one of the miracles of St. Nicholas. It has to do with he's from the Middle East. At one point, he's said to have saved a family from poverty, the 3 daughters from prostitution, by tossing them a golden bag of golden coins. So the connection to St. Nicholas happening in December, the custom now is to give golden or gilt covered, foil covered chocolate coins at St. Nicholas. And thus there may be this connection, both Middle Eastern sort of stories, both stories about liberation, both stories that have an affinity to chocolate. So maybe there's a connection. And of course, Gelt, German, Yiddish, Dutch, there are similar sounds and language and words. And so perhaps that's how Hanukkah Gelt comes to be chocolate.
Susan.
Yeah, hi. Okay. So the thing about candy is relatively new, as we know it today, in, let's say, the mid 1800s. So what's interesting is that holidays have become really, really commercial. And so what they've done is incorporated things that other cultures have had for various reasons and made them religious, not truly religious, but symbolically religious. And so we have the fruit slices, the Boston fruit slices, which we have at Passover. What does that have to do with Passover? Nothing, but it kind of works. We have the pulled sticks that then became decorations for the evergreen trees in Germany, and that became the candy cane. So when you look at Easter, we've got the Peeps I just talked about, and you have the Easter eggs. So all of these candies don't come out of the organic religious experience, but they do come out of the marketed one. And that is pretty much what we have today with even, with Hanukkah. I remember when I was, I remember when I was little, we used to get few little things that, for Hanukkah, little thing every day. And now it's this full-blown event with all these candies attached. And it's just yes and no. Yes, but really no.
I can think of one kind of good organic ritualistic sweets, which is the long-time religious tradition of giving sweets to boys and girls. I think when they learn the alphabet, of having like either putting honey or other sweets literally on the page and having them lick it, or having, like to associate the learning of sacred Jewish texts with the sweetness in your mouth, as the rabbinic phrase goes.
There's also actually the ufruf, the custom of celebrating sweetness at a wedding, an engaged couple, where a bar bat mitzvah student and people toss candy. In our congregation, there was always a discussion about how hard should the candy be. Maybe it should be softer. People are throwing it at the kids. Let's be careful.
There's also the honey. There's also the honey for the Sheva Brachot on Challah, and for the first year of a tradition, instead of salt on Challah for Shabbat. So there's definitely sweetness that gets pulled in. Maybe
absolutely.
Well, yeah, and I think in the end, the point is those hard candies came out of the medicines in the relatively new. Why do we throw hard candies? Because we're in the modern age, but we're also in the old age. So
one of the people who had a panelist link to the webinar, Kalman Weiser, has a question that was in the chat just for us. So I'm wondering, Kalman, if you want to unmute yourself and show yourself and ask the question yourself, since you can.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the engaging talks. There's a story in my family that my relatives who are from the Ottoman Empire brought the recipe for halva, for sesame halva, to the United States, to New York. But my relatives, of course, were illiterate. And my relative's literate business partner, according to the story, stole the recipe for halva and built the Joiva company. So it's a story of course, didn't work out so well for us. I wanted to know if what's the story with Joiva? Is there any remote possibility any of this is true? Or maybe you don't know anything about this particular case, but I thought I'd ask.
Oh, I love halva, and it's all over Israel, and certainly there's a long history of halva at Jewish delis, and I forget which comedian talks about having eaten halva sandwiches. There's a whole thing about halva sandwiches. There were chocolate sandwiches in Israel. I mean, when people were growing up in Israel during the Sena or the hard times when food was not so abundant as it is these days, a chocolate bar in the middle of a roll was like a meal. And my guess is they were also doing the same thing with halva. Joiva, I don't know who stole what, but and I don't really want to know, honestly. Maybe you do. But there's a good amount of Stryker Center at Temple Emmanuel in New York City did a program, and the Joiva people were there. So I'm sure you can find the recording and you can track back to the Joiva people if you really want to. They're pretty accessible and available in New York. It's still, functioning, happy company. Although they're getting, I would say they're run for the money with a lot of artisan halva makers in the area.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of people who have shared in the Q&A just like little fond memories. I'm not going to read them out because they aren't questions, things that end in question marks. But I did want to share with you that a lot of people, are stirred. Like it's interesting actually that that's a lot of instinct about childhoods and associations with childhoods, and people have contributed those kinds of things as if it was a chat, but it's in the Q&A, so not everybody can see it. One actual question though is about hard and soft candy, and if they have kind of different histories, or one's older than older than the other.
Which hard and soft candies do they mean?
I'm not sure. It's just there. I suppose like any kind of, this, if the manufacturing history of like, if it's easier to transport, or that one's older, or, any kind of the soft candies versus hard candies.
So the hard candies, as I mentioned before, are the boiled sugars, and they came out of a process of making medicines that were good for your throat and that eased your stomach and so forth. And they were fairly old. I mean, it's really hard to know exactly when these things started, but let's say around the 1500s, possibly earlier. But in North America, they came around the 1700s, where they were boiling sugar, spilling it out in front of the fire, putting all sorts of herbs, spices, whatever that was medicinal. And then they started just putting in things because it tasted good. The soft candies, and now when you're talking about soft, I'm going to assume that you mean things like maybe sweet tarts or like Necco wafers. Those were the soft paste. And the soft paste came also out of the apothecaries. And I think, maybe they were kind of like the aspirin kind of things. They were a softer paste. The sugar-based soft ones, and now you're talking about some of the mint creams and those kinds of things, those really were made for their own sake of being confections and being pleasurable and fun. And they remain so today. There are newer kinds of candies. The pulled creams, for example, go back to the, I'd say, mid to early 1800s, where the other ones go further.
Comment about kind of back to the ritual question. One of our guests has kind of noted the connection between spices for Havdalah, and in at least your talk, Susan, you sort of mentioned the slippage between the spicy, the sugar as spice. So there's a good another one. And we have one more again from one of our participants, from our colleague Koch Power. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question as well?
If that worked, did that work?
That works.
Okay. Rabbi Printz pointed out, we've got some stimulants, tea, coffee, cacao. Why did coffee become you're going to go out and do the cafe culture? And like Pinsker's book is all like, this is so important for modern Jewish culture, and it's important for the modern public sphere and all that stuff that coffee-based cafes became, right? These places. why didn't, I mean, it's totally counterfactual, like, I don't know, just like, but why weren't they like fountains of hot chocolate being served versus cocoa
Like
kind of becoming like a domestic drinking chocolate, you know, like Einstein's cup, you know. Anyway, so just any thoughts for?
Yeah, it likely had to do with the fact that coffee is transportable, right? So coffee started as eating coffee. And in wars where you really need the perk, right? The troops have always eaten just plain old coffee. In North America, you too, in North America, coffee was really important during the Revolutionary War because it was that plus chocolate was used against the British. So there are so many reasons it's easy to make. You can just eat it as such. You can boil it. You have a coffee. It grows without, you know, it's not as complex to grow. So there are a lot of reasons. It's really ancient and it's still around.
I'm going to give both of our speakers a chance to just have a last word. If you have a parting thought of something that came up during it but didn't quite fit into the Q&A, if you have a parting thought. If not, that's okay. I'll thank you afterwards.
I'm just noticing a comment or a question. In South America after World War II, chocolate was also a Jewish manufacturing endeavor. And what's interesting to me about that comment is, of course, there were a lot of refugees who went to South America from Europe, Jewish refugees who went to South America from Europe, but Nazis as well, unfortunately. One of the Israeli companies, De Carina, chocolate companies in the Golan Heights, was founded by an Argentinian woman whose family was initially from Europe and I believe Holocaust survivors. So her family's business went from Europe to Argentina and then to Israel, and it's a very lovely and successful company. And she uses some of those family recipes. The other thing that I would say is that also related to Argentina is that Bariloche has become, and I think since World War II, a kind of chocolate center and known as a chocolate center. And I think that has to do with the number of former German soldiers, Nazis, who settled in Bariloche. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to travel there to really source out the story, but somebody needs to look into that further, and hopefully it'll be me, but I'm open to having anybody do that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with all of you.
Susan?
Yeah, sure. So I think the one thing that I did want to touch base on is the role of candy as pure fun. So candy is something that is manufactured and we use it for fun. And we have a kind of strange relationship with fun. We trust it, maybe we don't. But that's where candy comes in. And it's just so significant. What you're talking about, putting the honey on the page, is the tip of that. Honey as such isn't candy, but what you do with it is. And so it can be a reward, say a honey candy, or it can be just an event, or it can be just an experience you want to share. But there is that part of all of these things that people struggled with and made possible. And that is for people to really just feel good.
Well, the both of you have helped us do that right in time for dinner. Everyone will probably have dessert before dinner tonight. And in these times when, you know, feeling good is an important thing to do as well, even in the context of a higher learning, Jewish higher learning institute such as ours. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation with the both of you. And on behalf of all of us at the Center for Jewish Studies at York and the many guests that we had joining us for the webinar, I'd like to thank you very much. And to the rest of you, remind you that you should stay tuned for interesting future upcoming events from the Center for Jewish Studies as well. And I wish you all a good night.
Good night. Thank you.